ndakati ndaenda kukliniki ndichirwara ndine zvaindinetsa. Ndasvika waiting room matinei takamirira kudhindirwa makadzi. Pakaita vakadzi vakadedzera kuti vane zvinovanetsa, vanenge vakaremerwa veve nepfungwa. Panze apo pana nambuya varipo 3 vakagara pamabhenji. Vanodawo zvavo kubatsirwa munogona kuenda munobatsirikana.
Pakliniki ipapo pamunouya pavanhu 10, 3 vavo vanenge vane dambudziko rekufungisisa asi vasingazivi.
Ndakazviona ndiri mumwe akanga akanyanya kuremerwa panguva iyoyo. Ndichibudamo ndakambotanga ndatya kuti pamwe vachataurira vamwe vanhu, sezvo ndiri kuzvinyara kuzviudza vandogara navo. Ndabuda ndakanosvikogara pabhenji raive nambuya mufungidza. Mbuya mufungidza ndibva wanditi, chiri kukunetsai mama chii? Ndati ini ndine zvinondinetsa, zvimwe zviri kundinetsa handikwanise kucheya nema-next door. Vakati isusu manje mashandiro edu atinoita tiri vekunonzi kufriendly bench. Mashandiro edu atinoita tine tsindidzo. Hatibvumirwe kuti chatataura nemipano tizochiudza mumwe munhu. Ndobva vandivimbisa kuti chero madzimai avaishanda navo 2 vakange varipo havazovaudza zvakare zvinhu zvandainge ndavataurira. Asi vakanditi ndine mibvunzo yandichakubvunzai. Ndobva vandibvunza mibvunzo yavakandibvunza. Pamibvunzo yandakavapindura vakabva vadzokera kumubvunzo wekuda kuzviuraya. Chokwadi panguva iyoyo pfungwa idzodzo ndakanga ndinadzo. Semunhu akanga akaremerwa, ndakanga ndakaremerwa zveshuwa. Ndakafirwa 1998. But pagore iroro rapfuura pamberi, hama dzemurume dzakadza kuona kuti vana vakura. Vakange vakuchidzoka bheki kuda kuuya kusitora imba. Chinova chinhu chakandiita kuti ndibatikane chaizvo, ende ndainyara even kuudza vandakagarisana navo kuti panguva ino ndanga ndichizviti ndinemba ndine vana vangu vakura, asi ndakuzoita homeless. Ende chinhu chinorwadza kuti nezera randinaro ndigozodzokera kumusha kuvabereki. Mbuya vanzwa izvozvo vakandibvunza kuti wangochida kuzviuraya nei? Ndikati kana kunwa hangu mushonga wemakonzo ndinonwa. Zvikanzi wakatenga here? Ndikati handina kutenga. Zvikanzi asi wangochifunga kuita sei? Ndikati ndachifunga kuti kana ndikawana mari ndozoutenga. Vakanditivo, ko vana zvauri kuda kuzviuraya iwewe?
Muzukuru, pamakaita pfungwa yekuda kuzviuraya, makange muine urongwa hupi kune avo vainge vachizosara imi mafa? Pamwe mwana muclient yangu pamwe ine vana kana kuti iri kuchengetawo mai. Saka ndinenge ndamubvunza kuti pawaida kuzviuraya iwe, vanhu vavaisiyava vaichazoraramawo sei? Saka mubvunzo iwoyo muzukuru anobva abatikana, anobva aona kuti chokwadi pfungwa yandanga ndafunga yekuzviuraya kuvana vangu vaizorarama nei. Watimo vana vangu vari kushumbika ndiri mupenyu, havana ari kundibatsira kuchengeta. Alright, ini ndafa, wachachengetwa nani?
Une chaukagadzirira vana here? Ndikati handina kana chekuti ndigadzirise nacho futi kugadzirira upenyu hwevana. Ivo ndichivapindura ndakatovati vana vangu vakura vanosarawo zvioneka. Zvikanzi hapana mwana anotanga nekuzvionera, asi kuti kana mwana achikura anotarisira chese chakanaka kubva kumubereki. Ivo handiti wakagadzirirwa nevabereki vako kuti usvike pawakasvika. Saka vana ivava uda kuzovasiya vainei. Ndakabatikana. Ndakabva ndadzokera zvakare kupfungwa iye yekuti murume wangu achifa 98, ndakati ndinofanirwa kugara pano pamba ndichishingirira vana vangu. But ndivo futi vana vaye vandanga ndakusiya futi vasina chavainacho, vasina pekutangira, ende dziri nherera. Ndanga ndakuvapa nherera double. Ndakawana mashoko akandidzikamisa zvokuti handigone kutenda friendly bench. Handizive kuti zvakabva nekupi. Ndototi ndakaita rombo rakanaka rekuenda kukliniki ndikasvikowana kuine chirongwa chakafanana ichocho.
Saka basa redu refriendship bench rakanaka chose, rabatsira vanhu mucommunity uye riri kudzidzisa kunyangwe vechidiki vaya vari kuuya zvakare pafriendship bench, vari kunwa misombodiya, zvinhu zvinodhakadhaka zviya, vari kuuya pafriendship bench. Munhu anongofunga kuti maybe ndikanwa doro, kana ndanwa doro ndife zvangu, handichafunga zvakawanda. asi vanhu vari kubatsirana kuti vakauya pafriendship bench tiri kuvadzidzisa, wobva wagamushira, wotoona rubatsiro, wakutenderera mberi nekufunga kwavo nekuchengetedza zvakare mhuri dzavo.
Ndakawana rudzidziso rwakakosha. Ndakabva pabhenji ipapo kana ndichisina pfungwa iyoyo zvachose. Kana kutaura kuno kwandiri kuita izvozvo, handina pfungwa iyoyo. Ndatoone pfungwa yekuona kuti vamwe vese vaye ezvinonda kuti kana ndikatarisao paTV, kana ndikateerera redhiyo, ndikanzwa munhu uye anonzi akomita suicide, aiwa kusi kuda kwake. Munhu iyeye ashayiwa rubatsiro nekuchimbidza, akawana rubatsiro rwakaita serwandakawana, haasvike panguva iyoyo. Iye zvino izvi kana munhu akandiudza kuti tora ichi chinouraya mufe, handichisina pfungwa iyoyo ende handizviiti. Ndakutomuudza kuti chinhu chakaoma kuita mukati meupenyu, ende ndakadzidza kuti dambudziko chero rakakura sei rinoshewa. Dambudziko iroro rinowana mumwe munhu anokudzikamisa ogokudzidzisa kuti ungararame sei mukati meupenyu usingakwanisi kuti ungotora kapfungwa keke kuti dai ndafa. Ndakaona kuti dai ndafa haina chainobatsira mukati meupenyu.
Hello and welcome to this latest edition of the Picturehub show. Today I have Dr. Dixon Chibanda and Cheryl.
Okay, so I'm Cheryl. On social media, I'm commonly known as Cheryl Nkosi. I identify as a mental health advocate, and I'm a graduate in international studies, criminology and criminal justice at undergrad and postgrad level. And now I'm kind of dedicating my time to mental health awareness.
Yes, so I'm a psychiatrist. I spend most of my time working on the Friendship Bench, which is a program we started more than a decade ago, where we train grandmothers to deliver basic psychological therapy in communities. I'm also involved in a lot of research, a lot of mental health research. I also teach at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, a course in global mental health.
Being mental health, people are involved in the mental health space. How does one know, or can you self-diagnose that I'm depressed? Is it possible for me to realize that, okay, before that thought of suicide comes, am I able to identify at some point that, okay, I'm depressed?
So I think it's not so much about identifying the diagnosis, depression, but it's the feeling that things are not okay in my life, that I am struggling, I'm failing to cope, I can't sleep. I have these suicidal thoughts where I feel I shouldn't be here anymore, I shouldn't be alive anymore. The interesting thing is a lot of people going through that do not know that they have depression, and a lot of people do not know that they can actually get help, that it's a medical condition which can be treated. Yeah.
I agree. It's not necessarily about finding the diagnosis, but I guess the little symptoms that come with depression. So it's more so like getting to a point where you're like, okay, I'm sad. Sometimes I don't even know why I'm sad. I'm just sad. And even if someone tries to cheer me up, it only lasts for 5 minutes. So I wouldn't say necessarily that it's easy to self-diagnose, but once you start identifying and stepping out of self and saying, okay, things aren't the same as they are when I'm happy, then perhaps.
So for me as a layman, just listening to what you're both saying, how do I draw the line? Because surely sadness happens sometimes, sometimes things don't always go the way I plan. How do I distinguish it starting to become a problem that might need to be addressed?
I would say once your feeling of being overwhelmed perhaps, or sadness lasts for like a period longer than you've ever experienced, be it maybe 2 weeks, then maybe you'd say, okay, this is not just sadness, maybe I need help. But as someone who's not a medical professional, I can't then say, okay, if you're sad for 2 weeks, it's definitely depression. But, you know, once you see that things are not okay and there's no longer a balance, it's just completely low for a prolonged period, then maybe I can start saying, okay, I need to go and seek help.
I totally agree with Cheryl, yeah. So, and I think you got it right as well when you said for a 2-week period. If you look at some of the sort of international tools that we use to identify people who have diagnosis, they normally talk about a 2-week period where you have sustained symptoms, you know, of sadness. But it's a great question when you say, you know, people experience sadness. Is every sadness depression? And it isn't, you know. Sadness becomes depression if it's prolonged and it affects the quality of your life. And you don't need to be a medical doctor or a psychologist to know that something is affecting your life, you know, in a negative way. You know, it can be functioning at work, functioning at school, within the family, the way you interact with people you live with, and, you know, losing interest in the things that you normally would have interest in doing, you know, isolating yourself, becoming aggressive, and as I mentioned earlier on, sometimes having thoughts of actually harming yourself and thinking that it's better if you were not here, if you were not alive anymore.
So my next question is, I'm a parent, I'm a friend, you know, I'm a teacher, and I notice, okay, my friend, my spouse, or whoever has had a prolonged period of just sadness. So say I'm a parent, I've got a teenager, my daughter or my son is locking themselves in their room. They don't want to come out, you know. What do I do? How do I proceed from there? Because my assumption just is trying to get mental health or trying to see a psychiatrist is something that's expensive, you know, and maybe, I don't know, what do I do in situations like that?
So in the context of teenagers, from my very limited experience, when they're often depressed, right, it's not necessarily shown as sadness towards parents. Sometimes it's aggression. Sometimes it's shutting down when that conversation starts. So I guess it's trying to find a way to get them out of their room even, and trying to get them to interact and seeing how they're relating to other people. And if you see that relation, that the communication is, you know, extremely different, I don't know if pulling them aside would be the best thing, but sometimes you need to do that. I mean, like, are you okay? Sometimes that's what a person yearns for. Something as simple as just being asked, are you okay? Not necessarily, are you depressed or are you sad? Just, are you okay? Or, how's your day been? Sometimes take the focus away from, you know, the clinical and just kind of humanize them and don't look at them as a potential diagnosis. As a teacher, it's the same thing. But don't make it too obvious, you know, because with children or teenagers, they feel othered once they're being pulled aside. Maybe it's break time. You're like, can I see you for a minute? They feel othered. So it could just be like on the way out when everyone's walking out, hey, are you okay? How's your day been? It starts off there, and then you can monitor how they react or how they respond in that moment, as well as over maybe your desired period of, I guess, analysis. Yeah.
I guess consistency as well.
Yes.
Because if it's coming out of the blue,
yeah,
I kind of also get, I guess, triggered to say, okay, why are you asking?
Yeah. Exactly. So it's that thing of maybe just exercising friendliness, not necessarily like I'm here looking out for you and I want to protect you. No, just being kind. Kindness goes a long way when someone is going through, you know, sadness of any kind.
Yeah, that's a great point. Kindness is a great tool, and you don't need to be trained to be kind. But just to add on to that as well, the other thing is, particularly with young people, in fact, any human being, we all have predictable patterns of behavior. I like to call them anchors. The things that you do on a regular basis that define who you are. Now, if you're a parent or a guardian or a spouse or a partner, whatever it is, know the anchors of your children. You need to know that my son always goes for football at this time of the day, on this time of the week. If that suddenly changes, it's an alarm bell. You know, your son always comes out of his room at this time of the day and plays with his siblings. If that changes over a sustained period, it's an alarm bell, it's a red flag. So I think oftentimes it's about identifying those red flags before things get out of control. You know, so to get to a point where parents suddenly say, my son needs to see a psychologist or a psychiatrist, often it's too late, you know. But we should try to intervene way before we get there, and the best way of doing so is understanding the anchors or the patterns of behavior that define our loved ones or those that we live with.
And maybe for you, Dr. Dixon, as a parent, because as Cheryl was speaking, in my mind, I had the thought that we're also dealing with culture, you know, and culturally, sometimes your dad is not the closest person, you know, and how do we then, or how can they take steps? Because I'm sure, in as much as culture is important, but I'm sure every parent wants their child to live, you know. How do we then begin to break that mold to say, okay, there's a distance between a father and his kids, where they can begin to be able to identify those anchors? Because surely you probably find out maybe the maid is the one who knows those anchors, and maybe the dad not so much.
Yeah. So that's a great question. So human existence is about relationships. Not just relationship with your father or your mother, but if the maid happens to be that anchor that child goes to, you should at least pick it up and say, all right, my son goes to the maid to talk, or my daughter when they have a challenge. And when that suddenly stops, then you know there's a problem. Who's my son going to when he has problems? And at least if the son cannot approach you for certain things, you can approach the maid and say, you know, look, I'm really grateful that my son comes to you when he has problems. I would appreciate if you told me from time to time if you feel there's something to be really concerned about. You know, that's one way of dealing with it. You know, because I mean, you know, these different dynamics within families, they do occur, you know, and sometimes children prefer to speak to their peers. Again, you need to know, who are my children playing with? You know, where do these kids that my children play with, what's their background? Do I know the parents? Do I talk to the parents? Can I pick up the phone and find out from my child's friends' parents what's happening? You know, so it's a network, and as you can see, as that network becomes bigger, the more resilient children can become, because they have a lot of supporting pillars in their lives.
I like that. I think what I'm also learning from this is to leverage as much information as you can. Doesn't matter if it's coming from the maid, your child's friend's parent. And I think also just having that communication from on different levels with different people, I think helps, from what I'm getting, I think helps to kind of safeguard and watch on each other. And then my other question was, it's expensive. That's the idea that's there. Is that true?
Yes. It is expensive to seek, I guess, professional mental health services, but there aren't just limited resources. That's the thing. And especially if it's something that you're seeking help with for the first time, you can start, it's steps to it. You don't just go straight to the psychiatrist because you think your child is struggling with something. It could be the counselor at church. You know, if you are religious people, if that's not something that you're necessarily into, the online platforms. Friendship Bench offers talk therapy online for free, and Orkla as well. They're based in Mbare. There are resources that are there. And then if you see that maybe something else is needed outside of those resources, outside of talking over the phone, you need someone maybe to see in person. Usually if you get a recommendation from like your family doctor, you can speak to them about those things and find out which doctors or which psychologists, psychiatrists are taking medical aid. If not, unfortunately, in some cases they don't take those things. It's something that you have to set money aside for because it's something that's very important. A lot of people tend to think of your physical health as the most important thing, but your physical health and your mental health need to be in balance for you to be okay, simply.
Okay. And would you say there's a stigma with, say, the budget is there and they're saying, okay, we need to see a psychiatrist. Is there any stigma in terms of, okay, maybe there's something wrong with me mentally?
Absolutely. I mean, when people hear of psychiatrist, the first thing that comes to mind is a person has lost their mind, or they are what I guess medically would be described as psychotic. Not necessarily that they have a problem with maybe their mood, a mood disorder like bipolar even. People would go as far as thinking you're experiencing the most absurd symptoms, some that don't even exist once they hear psychiatrist. So there definitely is that stigma. Or even a psychologist, but from what I've seen with conversations in these kinds of spaces, people are scared to even say they see a psychiatrist for fear of judgment. So I can imagine from the perspective of a parent who's dealing with a child who's going through some kind of mental health issues, it would be hard for them to confide in their friends because they too will need an anchor. They will need support from friends and family, but sometimes they end up, I guess, what's the word? Sacrificing their own mental health, to protect their children, so that people don't know that they're seeing a psychiatrist or considering seeing a psychiatrist or a psychologist. There's a huge gap that's there right now that needs to be filled for people to understand that psychiatrists don't just deal with people in a very old-fashioned way and they're putting them in straitjackets and these are people that will burn your house down. No. No.
And for you, Doc, what's your opinion?
I think that is very, very accurately described by Cheryl. In fact, the interesting thing is when you look at the statistics, psychiatrists spend most of their time talking to people who are quote-unquote described as normal. The psychotic patient is rare. It's around about 1%. The majority of people that we interact with have depression, anxiety, and other kind of related conditions. And this is something that we need to make the public aware of. Psychiatrists actually oftentimes are spending time talking to people who seem, normal, but they are struggling internally. And again, this is where the Friendship Bench comes in, where the grandmothers, as a neutral person in your community who is trained, can give you that space, for you to share your story, for them to listen to you and help you in an evidence-based way. Earlier on you were talking about a son who's not able to communicate with his father. The Friendship Bench provides an opportunity for people like that who feel they cannot communicate with family members, but they need to talk, they need to open up with someone. We provide that safe space, which is evidence-based. So yes, it's expensive to see a psychiatrist or a clinical psychologist, but we have a number of options that people can look up to as a starting point before you rush to a psychiatrist or a psychologist.
Okay. And then from that, from what Cheryl said, if parents are in a position where they are maybe afraid to let people know that, okay, my child is struggling, because the implication is then, oh, they're a bad parent. You know, maybe this child is behaving this way because the parent is. How do we then break? Is it possible to break that stigma? Because at the end of the day, it could potentially cost someone's life. The fact that they are afraid to be seen in a specific way.
That's a very interesting perspective. I think it's definitely possible to break that stigma, but it's not an easy or quick race. From where our country has come from in terms of mental health to where we are now, it's been a very long process, and I can only see it getting better. But for now, I think creating safe spaces for people of all ages, to learn more. Sometimes even, I guess, in confidence, maybe like subscriptions that people sign up for, parents that they can sign up for so they can learn about mental health, or just community members, people who want to help. If, the resources which do exist already, if the resources in place and they are increased and they're more accessible, not just to people who have access to internet, maybe partnering up with people who are like Econet, and people can sign up for it so they're not bombarded with those messages, but they can sign up to learn more about mental health, maybe even like word of the day. It could be describing a condition or a state or anything to do with mental health, and gradually creating a space where everyone has access to those resources to break the stigma long term, because it's not an easy thing to do, and it's going to take a while, maybe decades even, for people to sit like this in family setups and even just social setups.
Well, I think, yes, that is true. But the other thing about stigma that I'd just like to add is sometimes the medical professionals fuel stigma. When you look at psychiatry, for instance, the terms, the language that we use is often stigmatizing. And when you have a diagnosis as a patient, you can have what is called self-stigma, where you feel because of this diagnosis that you've been given, you are not a normal human being. And then you obviously have the stigma that the parents may have. You have stigma that comes from the public. And one way of dealing with stigma is to try and contextualize mental health from a very local, traditional perspective. For instance, I'll give you an example of the friendship bench. We, for instance, do not talk about depression. We talk about kufungisisa, And as soon as you mention the word kufungisisa, it resonates with people, and for some strange reason, people don't think kufungisisa is stigmatizing, but depression is stigmatizing. So again, it's the perception, and the cultural perception is very important. And I think this is one of the reasons why the grandmothers on the bench are effective, because they use local language. What they provide is rooted in the local wisdom and culture. They talk about kuvura pfungwa, kusimudzira, kusimbisa, which sound very non-clinical. But at the core of it all, they are providing a clinical service using local terms that the community resonates with. And I think as professionals, we need to move towards that kind of paradigm shift in the way we deliver mental health, where we use our own indigenous terms that make our people feel comfortable.
Yeah. That's actually leading to my next question, is looking at the Zimbabwe context and maybe even internationally, are there culturally systems that may have been there but not have been recognized that were helping with mental health in the community, in the family?
Definitely. Years back, in fact, before I started Friendship Bench, I had the opportunity of going to Benin for a WHO conference, and I went to a place called Ouida. Ouida is known as the capital city of voodoo. And voodoo for your average Zimbabwean or for your average human being is perceived as something that is evil. Voodoo is evil. Stay away from voodoo. But while I was in Ouida, I had an opportunity to visit these voodoo priestesses and see how they work. And the surprising thing is a lot of the people who were coming to seek services from the voodoo priestess were people who had, conditions that we are familiar with in psychiatry: depression, postnatal depression. Someone had just had, a seizure, and someone had a drinking problem. But the thing that struck me about the way they interacted was the empathy, how this voodoo priestess was able to communicate in a way that made this person, regardless of the symptoms that they were experiencing, feel at ease and be able to open up. And I think this is one of the challenges that we face in psychiatry. We often are unable to open up barriers that exist between us and the clients that we are trying to help. So when you think of culture itself, it is very important in mental health. And it's only recently that some of the more scientific classifications are beginning to realize that we need to have a healthy dose of cultural perceptions of different conditions in order for us to really reach out and make a difference in those communities, not just here in Zimbabwe. Recently there was a publication in Nigeria by Professor Oye Goreje, who worked with traditional healers in the treatment of psychosis. For a very long time, there was this belief that traditional healers do a lot of harm. But actually his study, and this was a clinical trial, a huge, massive study, his study showed that if traditional healers are given the parameters of behavior and referrals and who they refer, they are actually an important piece of the jigsaw when it comes to mental health, because our people predominantly will first go to a traditional healer before they come to a psychiatrist. Now imagine if traditional healers are empowered with that ability to say, this is a psychosis, this is an alcohol-related problem, this is depression, this person is suicidal, therefore they need to be referred. We could avoid a lot of the problems that we currently see, not only in Zimbabwe, I think across most low and middle income countries. Yeah, so culture is important. Culture is very, very important in mental health.
That's very interesting. So how, in my mind, I'm trying to think if I'm a traditional healer, client walks in and I identify, okay, this is the specific problem. What incentivizes me to not take this person's money and then tell them, go and see a doctor for that? In that clinical study, just out of curiosity, are there things that they were giving them, whether it's a mixture of herbs or whatever it is, that probably could help with dealing with some of the...
So, there are some traditional herbs that are known to work for some conditions. I mean, look, right now with COVID, everybody was taking Zumbani, so there are a lot of things out there that do work. And the good thing is now there's a lot of research going into traditional medicine where we can really objectively identify what the active ingredients are in some of these herbs. Yes, it might take time. So you also need to understand that with mental health, it's not just about the herbs. Like I gave you the example of voodoo, where all she did, this priestess was talk. She did not give anything. She just spoke to people, reassured them, and in some cases spoke to people and encouraged them to go and get help somewhere else. So mental health, I think predominantly is not about medication, especially when you think about global mental health. The medication is the next step if things fail, and often the medication becomes important when you fail to pick up the initial telltale signs. We talked about anchors. What are my son's anchors? Have I identified the anchors that have gone wrong? The sooner you identify them, the more likely you are to prevent your son getting into a state where they now need to see a psychiatrist. That's what we should be striving for, actually, within mental health. Empower communities so that they can manage the initial symptoms before they deteriorate.
Okay. So the next part of my questioning comes to, say we've skipped all of those stages, and someone has already made the choice to say, okay, my life is not worth living anymore. So there's two sides that I would like us to address. One is I decide to go through with it, but it fails, and in the process I get help. And my perspective changes. What is that like? Have you come across people like that, and how can that person get support? How do I get support? Say I've tried and failed, but then,
You've tried to self-harm?
Yes.
Okay, it's very complex. But I have come across a few people who have tried to self-harm, who've tried to go as far as suicide, and it hasn't worked. And there's two sides to that. Some of them become really angry, really upset, because they genuinely do feel that there's nothing here for them. And then it can get worse, and they continue trying to commit suicide. When I was in high school, actually, I was in boarding school, and I had a girl that was in my dorm that did that multiple times. And it was, traumatic to see her, go through that, because not many people pay attention to those things. So you see a child who starts off with, no one cares about me. It starts off, it's a process, no one cares about me. And everyone thinks, oh, whatever. And it's boarding school, grow up. And then it moves on to her self-isolating and missing when we're supposed to be in a certain place at a certain time. And then it's cutting. And then it's trying to look like they're doing rituals, which aren't actually rituals. And then literally jumping from the window. And then it doesn't work. And then they repeat the cycle. And then I have seen a person like that turn around and become a mental health advocate. But the process to get to that place is long and it's difficult, because it then goes back to what we were talking about earlier with stigma, where sometimes even if it's not parents, certain people in the community can, be unkind. And then they see that you have these issues, but the moment you say, I want help, they say, oh, you're going to see a doctor, a head doctor. You must be, and I hate to use this phrase, but you must be loony, or you must be crazy, right? And then some people can persevere through that. After working so hard to get to that point, they persevere, get help, and it changes. Or all the hard work they've done to get to that point to say, I need help, stops there. And then they go back to their cycle of wanting to, self-harm. It's very hard and very complex thing, but it's very possible for someone who has, self-harm before to get to a point where they are healthy mentally, emotionally, and even physically.
So say you notice something and you can see that, okay, a fellow student is struggling. What can I do to make that person's life, to possibly try and turn that situation around?
As a fellow student?
Yeah.
in my experience, if you're not friends with a person, it's very hard to get to that point where you're even having those kinds of conversation. But to create that environment where they can feel maybe safe around you is by giving them that, I guess, idea that you are genuinely here just to check if they're okay, if they've had a good day, and nothing more. Once they feel comfortable and they know that I have someone who genuinely cares about how my life is going, they can then open up. And usually in schools, there usually is maybe like a head of department who is either trained to counsel students or who might have a referral or can refer students to a psychologist outside of the school. Or some schools do offer psychological support, which is inclusive of school fees, so parents don't even have to worry about it. And most schools, if they do have psychologists, they don't divulge that information without the consent of that student. So as a student who wants to help another student, just give them the chance to have someone to talk to. And then once they get to that stage, you can escort them to the school counselor, the head of department, or whoever is relevant to help them.
So would it be wrong to say if I see it, I don't have the relationship, can I approach the responsible?
So you as a student then approach maybe the school counselor and say
Yes.
the student has. It's a very tricky question, because I feel that you're now to some degree violating maybe someone's troubles. I can't say space, but their troubles, because they might not be ready to divulge that information, which can cause them to spiral into an even worse situation. But if it's a situation that you as a student can see is really, really bad, more often than not, the teachers can see it too. And I would rather as a teacher do that for me than I do that. And the way that it's handled would be a lot less chaotic and dramatic. And often, students tend to have more respect for teachers, even if they're angry, kicking and screaming. There's no way they're going to act in the same manner they'd act if they found out that a fellow student did that, because then they might again spiral to a point where if they've been self-harming, they can say, oh, okay, not even the students can keep my confidence about what I'm going through. No one actually cares about me. They just want to spread rumors about how maybe I'm losing my mind. And so that means there's no one who's there for me. And then they finally go through with it and it works. I don't know what Dr. C thinks about that.
Yeah, I mean, you're quite right. Self-harm is such a complex, it's such a complex phenomenon. I often hear people say physically self-harming stops the emotional pain, and the emotional pain is worse than the physical self-harming. And there are two classes of physical harming. Well, this is putting it in a very, very simple way. There are those who physically self-harm as a way of breaking a pattern, a thought pattern, and inflicting pain on yourself breaks that chain of, whatever, negative thoughts, whatever you want to call it. And then you have the other group of people who self-harm with the intention of wanting to die. And this earlier group where people self-harm because they are going through a certain thought pattern can very easily lead to that stage where they want to self-harm for the purposes of wanting to terminate, their own lives. So it's pretty complex, but I think, again, when a person begins to self-harm, and that's the first thing we pick up, it means we've missed a lot of things. Nevertheless, when we pick it up, what we should try and do as much as possible is try and reflect. And if your child is self-harming, you want to sit down and reflect, where along the line did things begin to change? And you might actually see the patterns, because now you've suddenly become aware of what's happening and you're concerned. And if you can't see where things have gone wrong, and you feel you are not the best person to talk to your child about the self-harm, try to find out who it is that your child is close to. Again, all of this is about relationships. You know, when we strengthen the relationships that we have with the people that matter to us, we suddenly find ourselves in a better space. It's all about, every human being wants empathy. They want to feel respected and understood, even a child, even a teenager. You know, we often think in our culture that young people can be ignored. They need that too. And so if they've found a person who's able to convey empathy, and you happen to know who that person is, leverage that relationship to help your son. Often what you see typically in families is when a child deliberately self-harms, the family moves in and they impose all these restrictions, and you know, the child is forced to go to a psychiatrist, you know, not every deliberate self-harm actually requires a psychiatrist. Sometimes if you have the proper support system in place, you can do a lot more for that child than, you know, taking the child to a psychiatrist or a psychologist. So everything has to be taken into context. As we've mentioned earlier on, you know, there's stigma as well. You know, your child self-harms, you force them to go to a psychiatrist. You know, the psychiatrist puts the child on medication. The next thing, the child is being stigmatized because the child is having side effects. The child can't sleep. It's a vicious cycle. So one has to be very, very careful. The bottom line is the foundation has to be the relationships that that child has with the family and the extended family. And that's why we spoke about anchors. The best thing that a parent, a guardian can do is figure out what your child's anchors are and keep that in check all the time. Mwana wangu ari kuita zvinhu zvaanofanira kunge achiita here zvinomubatsira. You know, the positive things that your child does, they will be the, you know, the triggers in terms of the red flags that you may then sort of show up, you know, before actually the child even gets to a stage of self-harming. Yeah.
Say a victim end up passing away. What happens to the people who remain behind? Because for me, I'm thinking of, I'm the father of this child, you know. How do I deal with that, you know? Because for me personally, I would feel like I failed, you know. How do you move on from that?
It's difficult to move on from that. And yes, you're quite right. Most parents feel they've failed, you know, and a suicide is such a painful family event, community event, which requires healing, you know, and the healing that is required after a family member takes their own life through suicide can take years, because as you rightly say, your average family would conclude that they have failed. Why did they not pick up the signs that this family member was suicidal? You know, but again, as I said, it's about understanding those anchors. You know, sometimes we are all just absorbed in our own worlds, you know, with the work that we're doing. Everyone is under pressure, especially now with COVID, and everybody's working virtual, and sometimes you just don't have the time to pick up the change that is occurring. And as that change builds up, you know, by the time you realize, it might be too late. A person is dead.
I would say you don't move on, but you move forward with. So it's something that is a lifelong event when you've lost someone. Grief is not a linear process for anybody, be it the parents or any members of the community. So once, you lose someone to suicide, you often think, as you've rightfully said, maybe as a parent, I failed. As a friend, how did I not pick up on this? But once that event, has come to its final stop, there's now the event of living without that person. So I would say technically if you merge the two, it's one event. It's not a process of saying, how do I move on? It's how do I move forward knowing that this has happened? And with grief being such a weird and complex phenomenon, it comes in waves. So you could spend 3 years, having coped and gotten grief counseling and had a good support system, and then people kind of forget about you as the parent. Their lives move on, and then you're kind of forced to confront some of the emotions that you never expressed around your support system. And then you suddenly fall into a wave of sadness again, and then grief. And then something like the fragrance they used to wear reminds you of all the memories, and you start crying in a supermarket because someone walked past you. It's all about learning to have anchors, as Dr. C said. Who are my anchors? What are my anchors? Once I have those, whatever it is that I'm, trying to cope with, it's not going to make it, easy, but it'll make it easier or better to deal with, because it's not something you move on from, it's something you move forward with, because it's now adjusting to an entirely new chapter in your life.
As I was researching this topic, I came across a few articles where they were mentioning about just the way we talk about it, the way it's the subject of suicide is spoken about, and changing the language and using the use of certain phrases. An example is how you would rather not mention the word a person committed suicide, but rather died by suicide. And as a professional in mental health space, how could you explain what's the reason behind this change?
Well, when you say committed suicide, it's almost like you're trying to say someone committed a crime, and suicide is pretty complex. And this is why in some countries, suicide is still illegal, which is strange, you make something. So if you try to kill yourself, it's a criminal offense, and I know this was the case in Kenya. I'm not sure if it still was, just a few years ago. Things may have changed. It's because of that notion. But now, because we understand suicide better, it's complex. Using the word committed trivializes it. It's a very complex phenomenon, to get to the stage where a person, takes their own life. That's the reason. But, Cheryl might want to add on to that too, since you were in Kenya.
Yes, I was in Kenya, and I don't believe it's changed, actually. I believe it's still illegal. Mm-hmm. But what I've noticed is actually they have created support systems for people in place where, if you kind of need a timeout and you're going through that, there are facilities for that.
Yeah, well, that's good. Because I remember, we have this platform called Inuka, which is run in Kenya. And I remember speaking to one of the coaches from Kenya saying, I had a client who, had deliberately self-harmed, which is a crime in Kenya. And she was uncertain whether to refer, because if you refer to the hospital and you say this is deliberate self-harm, the hospital may call the police to say we have a case of deliberate self-harm. So she was in a bit of a catch-22 on how to handle that. Eventually the person was referred to a private psychiatrist who sort of promised not to spill the beans.
Yeah, that makes it challenging to even deal with the problem now. Yeah. Are there resources, places that people could go, resources that are available for people to begin to be able to deal with the issues of self-harm?
So, I mean, there's, like I mentioned earlier, the free talk therapy online on WhatsApp from Friendship Bench. And then if people maybe feel like they don't want to give out their number, there is a website called xotla.co.zw where they can also have confidential conversations.
And is this 24 hours?
Yes, it is
okay.
24 hours for xotla, and then for Friendship Bench there are stipulated hours for the week and for weekends.
Okay. And I'm not talking to a bot?
No, you're not talking to a bot, you're talking to a real person on both platforms. Yes. And then if it's something that maybe the person on the other end feels that needs more help, for xotla at least, they then say, can we refer you? It's always an open conversation, not we are referring you to someone, you need help. No, we're here to offer support, not to diagnose you. It's just therapy, we're just having conversation.
In addition to that, we also have the community minds on Friendship Bench on the website, which provides, a whole lot of material, which is very helpful in terms of providing guidance to families who may have someone who is struggling with mental health issues. We run webinars, podcasts. So these are all resources that are available. Not to mention the friendship benches, which are run by the grandmothers. You can normally find them within the communities attached to the primary healthcare facilities.
Yeah. Right. And maybe, I know this might open up a big door, but what do people in rural areas do? How can they access such services? Or not just rural areas, let me just quantify that. Low income communities, how do they access? Or are there platforms that they can...
I would say the talk therapy from Friendship Bench, if they're in really remote areas, would probably be the best for now, because it's over the phone, and if it's like, issues of airtime, if it's WhatsApp bundles, I think it might be a bit more cost effective to get like a WhatsApp bundle and then reach out. Obviously, going onto the other website, that would cost a lot of data to stay online and speak to someone. So I think for now, the free talk therapy being offered by Friendship Bench works pretty well. If there are other things, pretty sure they'll come, but I'm not sure if they...
Yeah, just to add on to that, we are introducing Friendship Bench in rural areas. We are now in Zaka, in Bikita, Shurugwe. We're a small team, but the idea is to have a Friendship Bench within walking distance for everyone, particularly here in Zimbabwe. But I think at the moment the lowest hanging fruit, as Cheryl says, is probably our WhatsApp platform, because most people in Zimbabwe have WhatsApp, so you can link up with our open line and get help through that.
Okay, and then just at the back of my mind, I'm also thinking, are there no, like a toll-free number, maybe from the Ministry of Health or something like that?
No, that's something we've been trying to get. It's not as simple. We thought it was an easy thing to do, but getting a toll-free number in Zimbabwe is a bit of a nightmare. So ideally, that's what we would want to have. And that's what we're trying to get in the long term, a toll-free number. So maybe if there's someone out there who wants to help us to get a toll-free number, we would be
thrilled.
Yeah.
Okay, Econet, Net1,
Everyone.
Tel1, everyone, thank you so much for visiting.
Thank you for having us.
Yes, and this brings us to the end of our episode, and my encouragement would be that, let's check up on each other, let's be more empathetic towards each other, we're living in very stressful times, and you never know at what state someone is at, and just having open doors to just talk to each other helps. Thanks.
Great.